On the evening of November 7th, 1986, the suburban streets of Garland, Texas lay quiet beneath the fading amber glow of autumn. Garland was the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways, where children rode bicycles along sidewalks lined with oak trees, and where the sound of a lawnmower on a Saturday morning was as predictable as the sunrise. It was a city of modest brick homes and well-kept yards, sitting just 20 miles northeast of Dallas, a world away from the violence that sometimes echoed through the larger city streets. But on this night, something terrible was unfolding behind the closed doors of a home on Colbath Street in the 3600 block, something that would remain hidden for nearly 4 decades. Something that would test the very limits of forensic science, of patience, and of a family's enduring hope for justice. The 1980s in Texas were a time of contradictions. The oil boom had given way to bust. The gleaming towers of Dallas still rose against the sky, monuments to ambition and wealth. But beneath that surface, ordinary people were living ordinary lives in the sprawling suburbs that radiated outward from the city center. Garland was one of those suburbs. A working-class city with deep roots and a strong sense of community. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked. The kind of place where violence seemed like something that happened somewhere else. Barbara Fay Villarreal was 27 years old. She lived in that quiet Garland neighborhood with her husband, and by all accounts, she was simply living her life. The details of her daily existence have been lost to the years. As is so often the case with victims whose stories are not told until long after they are gone. We do not know her favorite color, or whether she preferred coffee or tea, or what she dreamed about when she thought of the future. What we do know is that Barbara was young. She had her whole life stretching out before her, decades of possibility waiting to unfold. And on that November evening, someone she knew, someone who should have been family, took all of that away. Garland police officers responded to a disturbance call at the Colbath Street residence. They found Barbara Fay Villarreal lying on the floor. She was dead. Her body bore the evidence of a violent and sustained attack. Multiple stab wounds, the kind of injuries that spoke not of a momentary lapse, but of rage, of fury, of something deeply personal. Near her body, officers recovered a large kitchen knife. It had come from within the home itself. This was not a weapon that had been brought from the outside, not a gun purchased in secret, or a blade carried with intent. This was a tool of everyday life, something that had probably been used that very morning to prepare breakfast, turned into an instrument of death. The scene told a story of sudden explosive violence, the kind that erupts when anger boils over in close quarters, when a dispute crosses some invisible line and becomes something far more dangerous. The neighbors on Colbath Street must have felt the chill of what had happened settle over their block like a fog. One of their own had been taken from them in the most violent way imaginable. The police cars, the flashing lights, the stretcher carrying Barbara's body, these images would have burned themselves into the memory of anyone who witnessed them. In a place like Garland, murder was not common. It was the kind of thing you read about in the Dallas Morning News, not the kind of thing that happened next door. Garland police immediately began their investigation. In the hours and days that followed, they focused on those closest to Barbara. Her husband was among the first to be interviewed. In cases of domestic homicide, the spouse is always scrutinized, always examined under the harsh light of suspicion. But Barbara's husband cooperated fully with investigators, and after a thorough examination, he was cleared as a suspect in her murder. He and Barbara had no children, and the details of their relationship at the time of her death remained largely private. The investigators collected what evidence they could from the crime scene. Most critically, they recovered blood evidence. Blood that did not belong to Barbara. Blood that had been left behind by her killer in the violence of the attack. In 1986, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. The technology existed, but it was primitive by modern standards. The blood evidence was carefully preserved and eventually entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national database that links forensic laboratories across the country. But there was no match. The killer's DNA sat in the system like a message in a bottle, drifting through an ocean of data, waiting for the day when someone, somewhere, would finally be able to read it. And so the case went cold. Cold cases are a particular kind of torment. For the investigators, there is the frustration of knowing that the evidence exists, but that it is not enough. The answer is right there, locked inside the molecules of dried blood. But the key to unlock it has not yet been invented. the family, there is the slow, grinding agony of uncertainty. The phone calls that never come, the anniversaries that pass unmarked, the questions that echo louder with each passing year. Who did this? Why? Will anyone ever pay? The years passed. 1987 came and went. And then, in 1988, another tragedy struck. Barbara's husband, the man who had been cleared in her murder, was killed in a shootout in Mexico. The circumstances of his death added yet another layer of darkness to an already devastating story. Whatever he knew, whatever he might have been able to tell investigators, whatever leads he might have provided, died with him south of the border. For the detectives of the Garland Police Department, the case of Barbara Fay Villarreal became one of those files that never quite goes away. It sat in the cold case archives, a manila folder growing thick with photographs and witness statements and forensic reports, all telling the story of a young woman whose killer had walked away free. New detectives would pull the file, read through the reports, study the crime scene photographs, and try to find some angle that their predecessors had missed. Each time, they came up empty. Detectives came and went. Careers began and ended. Retirements were celebrated. But Barbara's case remained open, a wound in the department's collective memory that refused to heal. Throughout the years, the FBI joined the investigation, working alongside Garland detectives to follow leads that stretched across two countries. Tips came in from both the United States and Mexico. Each one was investigated. Each one led to another dead end. The case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. Another name on the long list of victims who never received justice. But the world was changing in ways that no one in 1986 could have imagined. While Barbara's case file gathered dust, the science of DNA analysis was advancing at an extraordinary pace. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, had mapped the entire blueprint of human genetics. Forensic techniques that would have seemed like pure fantasy in the 1980s were becoming routine tools of criminal investigation. What had once been a crude instrument, capable of only the broadest identifications, was becoming something far more powerful, far more precise, and far more dangerous to those who believed their crimes had been buried by time. And in the 21st century, a new technique emerged that would change cold case investigations forever. Investigative genetic genealogy. The concept was deceptively simple. Instead of waiting for a direct match in the CODIS database, investigators could now upload DNA profiles to public genealogy databases, the same databases used by millions of ordinary people to trace their family histories. Websites like GDmatch and Family Tree DNA had become enormously popular, with people voluntarily submitting their DNA to discover distant relatives, to fill in the branches of their family trees, to connect with cousins they had never known existed. What these users may not have fully appreciated was that their DNA could also be used to identify criminals. When a relative's DNA appears in a public database, it creates a genetic breadcrumb trail. Investigators can follow those connections, mapping out family trees, narrowing down the list of potential suspects until they arrive at a single individual. And that is exactly what happened in the case of Barbara Fay Villarreal. Decades after the murder, cold case detectives with the Garland Police Department submitted the preserved blood evidence for testing using investigative genetic genealogy. The analysis was conducted in coordination with Advanced DNA, a forensic laboratory specializing in genetic genealogy. Cheryl Hester, the director of forensic and genetic genealogy at Advanced DNA, oversaw the work. The results were remarkable. The DNA from the crime scene matched a close relative of Barbara's husband. Not the husband himself, who had long since been cleared and who had died in Mexico years earlier, but someone in his family. Someone whose genetic profile was close enough to indicate a brother, a sibling, a man who shared the same bloodline. The trail led investigators to a name, Liborio Canales, Barbara's brother-in-law, the brother of her husband. A man who had been in Barbara's life, who had been welcomed into her home, who had shared meals and holidays and the ordinary intimacies of family, and a man who, according to the science, had left his blood at the scene of her murder. The revelation must have sent a shockwave through the investigation. For decades, detectives had been searching for a stranger, an unknown assailant, someone from outside Barbara's world. Instead, the killer had been hiding in plain sight all along, concealed within the very family that had been torn apart by Barbara's death. Liborio Canales was a Mexican citizen who had been living primarily in Mexico for decades. He had crossed the border freely, living his life in apparent peace, while the family of the woman he had killed waited in anguish for answers that never came. For 37 years, Canales had evaded justice, not through any particular cunning or criminal sophistication, but simply because the technology to identify him did not yet exist. But now it did. The FBI placed Canales under surveillance. They knew he was living in Mexico, beyond the immediate reach of American law enforcement. They watched. They waited. And then, in July of 2023, an opportunity presented itself. Liborio Canales crossed the border from Mexico into New Mexico. He was 85 years old, and he had come to the United States for the most ordinary of reasons. He wanted to celebrate his birthday with family in the small town of Lovington, New Mexico. It was meant to be a celebration, a gathering of loved ones, a moment of joy in the twilight of a long life. Instead, it became the moment that justice finally caught up with him. Lovington, New Mexico is a small city of roughly 10,000 people, nestled in the southeastern corner of the state near the Texas border. It is the kind of quiet, unassuming place where an elderly man arriving to visit family would attract no attention whatsoever. But the FBI had been watching. They had been tracking Canales' movements, waiting for the moment he would step onto American soil. And when he did, they were ready. On July 18th, 2023, officers from the Lovington Police Department, working in coordination with the FBI and the Garland Police Department, arrested Liborio Canales on a federal murder warrant for the killing of Barbara Fay Villarreal. He was booked into the Lee County Detention Center. His bond was set at $1 million. The birthday celebration he had planned would never take place. Instead of cake and family, Canales found himself in a jail cell, facing a charge that had been waiting for him for 37 years. And then, in custody, Canales did something that investigators had waited nearly 4 decades to hear. He confessed. Liborio Canales admitted to the homicide. He told detectives that he had killed Barbara Villareal because he was angry over a family dispute, a family argument. The specifics of that argument have not been made public, but whatever the cause, whatever words were exchanged, whatever grievance Canales believed he held, it had driven him to pick up a kitchen knife and end a young woman's life. A family argument. That is what it came down to. Decades of suffering, decades of unanswered questions, decades of a mother wondering who had taken her daughter, all because of a family argument. The extradition process brought Canales from New Mexico to Texas, where he was held in the Dallas County Jail to face the charge of murder. And on March 12, 2024, at the age of 86, Liborio Canales stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to the murder of Barbara Fay Villarreal. He was sentenced to 20 years in a Texas prison. At 86 years old, it was, in all likelihood, a life sentence. The years he had stolen from Barbara would now be mirrored by years of his own spent behind bars, confined to a cell in the same state where he had committed his crime nearly 4 decades earlier. The conviction was historic. It marked the first time the Dallas County District Attorney's Office had secured a murder conviction using investigative genetic genealogy. The technology that had seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier had delivered justice in a case that had seemed impossible to solve. But for Barbara's family, the significance was deeply personal. Barbara's mother was 93 years old when the conviction came. She had spent nearly 4 decades waiting, hoping, refusing to give up on the belief that someday someone would answer for what had been done to her daughter. She had lived through the murder of her child. She had lived through the death of her son-in-law in Mexico. She had lived through decades of silence and frustration and grief. And she had lived long enough to see the man who killed her daughter brought to justice. The family released a statement after the sentencing. They said they would never let Canales occupy their thoughts again. They said the life he had lived, the decades of freedom he had enjoyed while Barbara lay in her grave, should be considered a gift he did not deserve. There is something profoundly unsettling about this case. Not just the violence itself, though that is terrible enough, but the proximity of the killer. Liborio Canales was not a stranger. He was not some unknown figure who appeared from the shadows and vanished into the night. He was family. He sat at the same tables. He shared the same blood. He was the brother of the man Barbara had married, the man she had chosen to build her life with. And he killed her over an argument. For 37 years, he had lived with that knowledge. He had woken up each morning, eaten his meals, celebrated his birthdays, watched his hair turn gray and his body grow old, all while carrying the secret of what he had done on that November evening in 1986. One wonders whether he ever thought about Barbara in those quiet moments before sleep, whether her face ever appeared in his dreams, whether the sound of a kitchen drawer opening ever made his hands tremble, or whether he had simply locked the memory away, sealed it behind some internal door, and gone about his life as though nothing had happened. We will never know. What we do know is that for 37 years he lived as a free man. And for 37 years, Barbara Fay Villarreal lay in her grave, her murder unavenged. The streets of Garland, Texas have changed since 1986. The city has grown, new neighborhoods have been built. The world that Barbara Fay Villarreal knew has been transformed in ways she could never have imagined. But for nearly 4 decades, her story remained frozen in time, trapped in that November evening, in that house on Colbath Street, where the sound of violence shattered the suburban silence. It took 37 years. It took advances in science that no one could have predicted. It took the patience of detectives who refused to close the file. It took the quiet persistence of a mother who would not let her daughter be forgotten. And in the end, it took a birthday party. An 85-year-old man crossing a border to celebrate with family, never knowing that the same science that connects families would be the very thing that connected him to his crime. This case stands as a reminder that no crime is ever truly perfect, that no secret is ever truly safe. The blood that Liborio Canales left behind on that November evening in 1986 became the instrument of his undoing. Not immediately, not quickly, but inevitably. The same substance that flows through families, that connects parents to children and siblings to one another, became the thread that investigators followed back through the decades to find the man who had wielded a kitchen knife against a 27-year-old woman in a quiet Texas suburb. Justice is not always swift. Sometimes it moves at the pace of decades. Sometimes it waits for the technology to catch up with the truth. Sometimes it requires the tireless work of investigators who refuse to accept that a case is truly cold, who believe that every victim deserves an answer, no matter how many years have passed. But in the case of Barbara Fay Villarreal, justice came. Late, imperfect, and burdened with the weight of all those lost years. But it came. And for that, at least, we can say that Barbara Fay Villarreal was not forgotten.